Timothy Coggins. The first case on our list is Timothy Coggins, a man whose killing went ignored for 35 years before a single conversation behind prison walls finally cracked it open. What could possibly keep a brutal killing buried for 3.5 decades? And what made it finally surface? On the night of October 7th, 1982, Timothy Wayne Coggins, a young black man who lived with his sister Peggy Richards in Spalding County, went to a club called the Palomino. He was 23 years old, known to friends as someone who loved to dance, and that night he was dancing with a white woman. In rural Georgia at that time, that was enough to mark him. Two white men, Franklin Gebhardt and his brother-in-law, William Moore Sr., lured him outside. They drove him to a field off Minter Road in Sunnyside. There, they stabbed him roughly 30 times. An X was carved into his abdomen. They chained him to the back of a pickup truck with a logging chain and dragged him until he died. 2 days later, on October 9th, hunters found his body. The original investigation lasted barely 2 months before deputies closed the file. Decades later, in closing arguments, District Attorney Benjamin Coker would tell a courtroom that one of the original detectives had been pulled off the case to investigate a destroyed mailbox, and that to those handling it, Timothy was just another forgotten name. Was anyone ever going to come back to this? Peggy Richards testified years later about what her family endured in the months after Timothy died. A bloody white shirt was left for them. A brick arrived with a threatening note tied to it. A headless dog carcass was placed on the property with a note that read, "You're next." The message was simple: stop asking questions. For 33 years, nothing moved. Then, in 2015, a man named Christopher Vaughn, an inmate already convicted on unrelated charges, told investigators that Frankie Gebhardt had been bragging in prison for years about killing a black man named Tim. Gebhardt was already locked up on another conviction. In December 2016, Sheriff Darrell Dix and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation officially reopened the file. What they did next had never been done before in Georgia. Investigators used a hydrovac system to excavate a well on Gebhardt's property, the first time the technique had ever been deployed for a well dig in the state. What they pulled out matched what Vaughn had described word for word: a white tank top, shoes, socks, a chain, and a knife handle missing its blade. On October 13th, 2017, 5 people were arrested. Gebhardt and Moore were charged with murder. 3 others were charged with obstruction. Lamar Bunn, a part-time Milner police officer, and Gebhardt's nephew, Sandra Bunn, his sister, and Gregory Huffman, a Spalding detention officer. According to the warrants, Lamar Bunn had allegedly advised Gebhardt on methods to prevent DNA collection. Huffman had allegedly revealed the identity of a confidential informant. The cover-up reached deeper than anyone had imagined. On June 26, 2018, Frankie Gebhardt was convicted of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, aggravated assault, and concealing a death. Judge W. Fletcher Sams sentenced him to life plus 30 years. Sams told him from the bench, "Hopefully, sir, you have stabbed your last victim." 2 months later, on August 16th, Bill Moore Sr. pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and concealing the death of another. He was sentenced to 20 years to serve plus 10 years probation and banished from the Griffin Judicial Circuit if he ever walked free. He arrived in court in a wheelchair. But here is where the story refuses to close. As of today, there has been no publicly reported disposition for the obstruction charges against Lamar Bunn, Sandra Bunn, or Gregory Huffman. They were indicted in December 2017. In August 2018, The district attorney said the cases were still pending. Lamar Bunn is currently listed as the sitting chief of police of the Milner Police Department. While justice finally caught one chapter of Spalding County's history, another Georgia mystery would spend 12 years sitting on a bedside table, waiting for someone to pick up the phone. Tara Grinstead. The next case is Tara Grinstead, and for over a decade, her name represented the longest active missing persons file in Georgia. A beauty queen, a teacher, a coach, gone in a single night, with one single clue left behind. Why did it take 12 years for someone to listen? Tara Faye Grinstead was born in 1974 in Hawkinsville, Georgia. By the time she was 30, she was a history teacher and JV cheerleading coach at Irwin County High School in Ocilla. She had been crowned Miss Tifton in 1999, competed in Miss Georgia, and held a master's degree from Valdosta State University. On Saturday night, October 22, 2005, Tara was last seen after coaching contestants at the Miss Sweet Potato pageant in Fitzgerald and attending a barbecue. When she failed to appear at school on Monday morning, October 24th, colleagues called for a welfare check. What officers found inside her home was strange in a way that did not match a runaway and did not match a burglary either. Her cell phone sat on its bedside charger. Her bed was unmade. A bedside lamp was broken. Her car was still parked outside. Her purse and keys were missing. And in the front yard, lying in the grass, was a single latex glove. One glove, that was it. That glove would sit in evidence for the next 12 years. In 2008, the CBS program 48 Hours aired an episode called Stolen Beauty that publicly revealed the glove for the first time, along with the fact that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had pulled an unknown male DNA profile from it. In 2009, a video appeared online from someone calling himself the Catch Me Killer. It turned out to be a hoax traced to a man named Andrew Haley. Lead after lead went nowhere. Then in 2016, a podcaster named Payne Lindsay began releasing episodes of a show called Up and Vanished. He started knocking on doors in Ocilla, calling people who knew Tara, asking the questions that had not been asked in years. The town began to talk. In February 2017, a woman named Brooke Sheridan walked into the GBI office. She was the girlfriend of a man named Bo Dukes. She told agents that Bo had confessed to her. He had said that his friend Ryan Alexander Duke, no relation, had killed Tara back in 2005, and that Bo had helped burn her body in a pecan orchard owned by his uncle Randy Hudson. On February 23, 2017, Ryan Duke was arrested. Ryan gave a recorded confession claiming he had been burglarizing Tara's home to steal cash, that she had caught him, and that he had struck her with a fatal blow. GBI forensic scientist Ashley Hinkle would later testify that approximately 90% of the DNA on the latex glove was Ryan Dukes. In March 2019, Bo Dukes was convicted in Wilcox County of concealing a death, making false statements to the GBI and hindering apprehension. He was sentenced to 25 years. Then came Ryan Dukes' trial. It began May 9, 2022, in Irwin County. On the stand, Ryan recanted his entire confession. He told the jury he had given the statement in 2017 while under the influence of drugs and out of fear of Bo. He testified that Bo had woken him in their shared trailer the morning after Tara disappeared and admitted to the killing himself. On May 20, 2022, the jury delivered a verdict that stunned the courtroom. Ryan Duke was acquitted of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. He was convicted only of concealing a death. 3 days later, Judge Bill Reinhardt imposed the maximum 10-year sentence and told him, "Every day, They couldn't find Tara. You had the power to stop that pain for years. For Tara's family, the truth of what happened that October night remains a wound that no verdict has closed. And in another part of the state, a different family wound was about to be exposed in a way no one was prepared for. Imani Moss. The next case is one that left an entire community asking how a child could vanish in plain sight. Imani Moss had teachers, neighbors, a father, and an entire household around her. So how did she end up forgotten in the room next door? Imani Gabrielle Moss was born April 23, 2003. Her father, Iman Giovanni Moss, won custody of her shortly after her birth. Her biological mother was unable to care for her. In July 2009, Iman married Tiffany Nicole Moss, born July 20th, 1983. From that point forward, Tiffany became the primary woman in Imani's life. The warnings were there from the very beginning. In March 2010, Tiffany was charged with cruelty to a child after striking Imani with a belt. She pleaded guilty and was placed on 5 years probation. Imani was briefly placed with her paternal grandmother, Robin Moss, before being returned to the household. In 2012, Imani's school reported emotional and psychological neglect. There were complaints that Tiffany had struck her for eating too slowly. Imani tried to run away from home twice. How many alarms have to sound before someone listens? By late 2013, the situation inside the Coventry Point Apartments in Lawrenceville had reached a point that defied comprehension. Tiffany had confined Imani to a single bedroom and stopped giving her food. For several weeks, while Tiffany continued to feed her 2 younger biological children, Imani went without. According to court records, Tiffany even baked cookies in the kitchen that Imani would have been able to smell through the walls of her room. On October 24, 2013, Imani had what was described as a seizure. She was found unresponsive in the bathtub. 4 days later, on October 28th, she died. At the time of her death, she weighed 32 pounds. That is the average weight of a 3-year-old. Imani had just turned 10. Tiffany and Iman did not call for help. They did not call police. Instead, for the next several days, they hid what had happened. On November 2, 2013, they placed Imani's body inside a trash can outside the apartment complex and burned it. Iman called police that night. When Gwinnett County District Attorney Danny Porter spoke publicly about the case, he said it was the worst case he had seen in his entire career. Iman Moss was offered a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against his wife. He pleaded guilty and accepted life without the possibility of parole. Tiffany's trial began in April 2019, and what happened inside that courtroom was almost without precedent in Georgia. Tiffany chose to represent herself. Standby counsel, attorneys Emily Gilbert and Brad Gardner from the State Capitol Defenders, sat at the table beside her, but could only watch. Tiffany gave no opening statement, called no witnesses, cross-examined no one, and offered no closing argument. She addressed the jury only at sentencing. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict her. The penalty phase deliberation lasted roughly 2.5 hours. On May 1st, 2019, Tiffany Nicole Moss was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Today, Tiffany Moss is the only woman currently sitting on Georgia's death row. She is housed at Arundel State Prison in Alto. Judge George Hutchinson initially set an execution window for June 7th through 14th, 2019. But the date was automatically stayed by appeal. In January 2024, Gwinnett Superior Court Judge Karen Byers rejected her motion for a new trial, finding that she had knowingly and voluntarily chosen to represent herself. If her sentence is ever carried out, Tiffany would become only the third woman executed by the state of Georgia since 1945. The first was Lena Baker in 1945. The second was Kelly Renee Gissendaner in 2015. Imani's name lives on every time her stepmother's case appears on a docket. While one Georgia household hid a tragedy behind closed doors, another would soon play out in a parking lot, in broad daylight, with cameras everywhere. Cooper Harris. The next case is Cooper Harris, and it became one of the most debated trials in modern Georgia history. A father, a son, a hot car, and a question that two different juries answered in two completely opposite ways. Was this the worst kind of intentional killing or the worst kind of accident? Cooper Mills Harris was 22 months old. His parents were Justin Ross Harris and Leanna Taylor Harris. On the morning of June 18, 2014, Justin was supposed to drive Cooper to daycare before heading to his job as a web developer at the Home Depot's corporate offices in suburban Atlanta. They stopped together for breakfast at a Chick-fil-A. Then Justin drove to the office. He parked, he walked inside, and he left Cooper strapped in his rear-facing car seat in the back of the Hyundai Tucson. Cooper sat there for approximately 7 hours. Records show the outdoor high that day reached 92 degrees Fahrenheit. At trial, heat expert David Michael Bronny of Applied Technical Service testified that interior temperatures in the parked vehicle peaked around 125 degrees. Cooper died of hyperthermia. Justin discovered him on the drive home that evening. He pulled into a strip mall parking lot. He pulled Cooper out of the back seat. He began screaming. Witnesses called 911. Police arrived within minutes. What looked like a horrifying tragedy began to take a different shape almost immediately. Investigators pulled records from Justin's work computer. What they found set the entire case on fire. On the same day Cooper died, Justin had been exchanging messages with multiple women, including a 16-year-old. Detectives uncovered multiple extramarital affairs, the exchange of nude photographs with women and a minor, and at least one paid encounter with a sex worker. The Cobb County District Attorney built a theory around what they had found. They argued Justin had killed Cooper intentionally to free himself from his marriage and pursue a double life. How could a jury possibly separate one set of facts from the other? 3 weeks of jury selection in Cobb County failed to produce an unbiased panel. Judge Mary Staley Clark moved the trial to Brunswick in Glynn County. Jurors heard from 70 witnesses across the proceedings, 52 of them called by the prosecution. On November 14, 2016, Justin Ross Harris was convicted on 8 counts, including malice murder. He was sentenced to life without parole on the murder counts. He also received 32 additional years on sex crimes involving the 16-year-old, including felony attempted exploitation of a minor and 2 misdemeanors for distributing obscene material to minors. For nearly 6 years, that verdict stood. Then in June 2022, the Georgia Supreme Court took the case apart. In a 6-3 ruling written by Chief Justice David Namias, the court found that the jury had heard and saw an extensive amount of improperly admitted evidence. Namias wrote that the state had convincingly demonstrated Justin was a philanderer, a pervert, and even a predator, but that the evidence did little to answer the central question of his intent the moment he walked away from Cooper that morning. The murder and child cruelty convictions were reversed. The sex crime convictions were upheld. Justices Charlie Bethel, Sean LaGrua, and Verda Colvin dissented in part. On May 25, 2023, the Cobb County District Attorney announced the office would not retry Justin Harris, citing the loss of critical motive evidence. Defense attorney Carlos Rodriguez told reporters that the dismissal confirmed Cooper's death had been unintentional and therefore not a crime. Justin served his 12-year sex crime sentence, made up of a 10-year felony and 2 consecutive 1-year misdemeanors at Macon State Prison. On June 16, 2024, which fell on Father's Day, he was released from state prison and transferred to Cobb County Jail to finish the final misdemeanor year. He has since been released entirely. Cooper's death remains, in the eyes of the law, no longer a murder. While one Georgia courtroom debated the question of intent for years, an entire community on a lake would face a far simpler question with no answers at all. Who walked into that house? Russell and Shirley Dermond. The final case in this section is one that breaks every pattern. There is no killer in custody. There is no confession. There is no clear motive. And there is no head. What happened at the house on Carolyn Drive? Russell Joseph Dermond was 88 years old. A Hackensack, New Jersey native, a World War II Navy veteran, and a retired Hardee's franchise owner. His wife, Shirley Bell Dermond, was 87. The two had been married since December 15, 1950. They had 4 children and 9 grandchildren. The Dermonds lived in the Great Waters subdivision, an upscale gated community on Lake Oconee in Putnam County. Their home sat on Carolyn Drive, valued at roughly $1 million, with the water at the back door. Russell was last seen alive running errands on May 1, 2014, picked up on surveillance footage at a Publix grocery store. 2 days later, the couple failed to attend a Kentucky Derby party they had been expected at. On May 6, 2014, a concerned neighbor walked over to check. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked untouched. Then the neighbor opened the door to the garage. Russell's body was on the floor in a small pool of blood. His head had been removed and was nowhere in the house. Shirley was missing entirely. The first searches focused on the lake. 10 days later, on May 16th, 2 fishermen spotted a body floating on the surface roughly 5 miles from the home. It was Shirley. Her ankles had been weighted with red cinder blocks, around 60 pounds of concrete total. The medical examiner determined she had died of blunt force trauma. As of today, Russell's head has never been found. Putnam County Sheriff Howard Sills, who has worked this case from the day it began, believes Russell was most likely shot in the head. Gunshot residue was found on his shirt, which would explain the removal of the head as an attempt to destroy ballistic evidence. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. There was no struggle in any other room, only the garage. Sills told reporters early on, "There's no way one person did this. I'm not going to say it's absolutely physically impossible, but it's highly unlikely." Could a stranger really walk past a manned guardhouse, find the right house, and leave again without being seen? Investigators ruled out robbery and burglary immediately. Nothing in the home had been taken. The gated community had a guardhouse at the front, but the lakeside was completely open to anyone with a boat. In May 2015, a man was spotted on the Dermonds' property who became known as the Mystery Man. Sheriff Sills interviewed him. No arrest followed. FBI Special Agent Andy Smith, who has personally worked the file for 9 years, told 11 Alive, "I've been an FBI agent for over 20 years. This is one of the strangest cases that I've seen. And if you have made it this far and enjoy content like this, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next." The case sat almost completely still until 2024. In February of that year, Sheriff Sills personally hand-delivered evidence to a forensics lab in Utah. In May 2024, investigators announced something new. Touch DNA from an unknown individual had been recovered from Russell's shirt. The profile did not match Russell. It did not match Shirley. It belonged to someone else who had been close enough to leave skin cells behind. The FBI continues to offer a $20,000 reward for information that leads to an arrest. Sheriff Sills has urged caution on the new DNA finding. He has reminded the public that touch DNA can come from any number of sources, including a lab technician handling the evidence years ago. But it is the first new lead in years, and the case is no longer sitting still. As of today, no suspect has been publicly named. Russell's head has never been recovered. And on Lake Oconee, the question of who pulled into the Great Waters subdivision in early May 2014 remains exactly where it has been for over a decade. Open. Wendy and Randall Bure. The next case is Wendy and Randall Bure, a Lawrenceville couple whose killers spent a full week eating takeout in the same house where their bodies were decaying. How does something like that happen inside a quiet suburban neighborhood? And why did no one notice for 7 days? Wendy Woodruff Bjorga was born in 1954. She and her husband Randall were both 63 years old. They lived at 1911 Furlong Run in Lawrenceville, Georgia, a residential street in Gwinnett County. By the spring of 2017, they had taken in their teenage granddaughter, Cassandra Bjorga. The relationship was not a healthy one. Cassandra, known to family as Cassie, was a chronic runaway. Between October 2015 and March 2017, Gwinnett County Police had been called to the Bjorga home a documented 31 times. 18 of those calls were runaway reports. 8 were welfare checks. The remainder involved domestic disputes and suspected drug activity inside the residence. Wendy and Randall were trying to hold a household together against a current they could not control. Cassandra had a boyfriend named Johnny Hero Ryder. He was 19 years old. Together, the two of them began discussing something far more serious than running away. They began planning to remove the obstacles in their lives. They drew up a written list. On it were Wendy and Randall, Ryder's own parents, Cassie's mother, Ryder's sister Mindy, and Mindy's boyfriend Kevin. The list was the plan. Around the night of April 1st, 2017, after the lights inside the Furlong Run home had gone off, Cassie used her own house key to let herself and Ryder in. According to court records, Cassie ambushed Wendy. Ryder went after Randall, kicking him and beating him with a tire iron while Wendy was forced to watch. Then both Wendy and Randall had their throats cut. Investigators would later document the use of a baseball bat, a hammer, and butcher knives during the killings. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as an incision to the throat, with blunt and sharp force trauma. What happened next defied belief. Cassie and Ryder did not flee. They did not call anyone. They did not even leave the house. Instead, they caulked the doors of the upstairs bedrooms where the bodies lay, sealing the smell of decomposition inside. Then they continued living downstairs for about a week. They hosted friends. They ordered Chinese food. Could anyone really sit in a kitchen and order delivery with what was on the floor above them? The reason the bodies were finally found had nothing to do with neighbors growing suspicious. On April 8th, 2017, Cassie and Ryder drove the Bjorga's own car to Ryder's sister Mindy's home at 1685 Rambling Woods Drive. They intended to attack Mindy and Kevin next, following the list. Mindy and Kevin escaped from the house and called 911. When officers responded, they noticed the Bjorga's car parked outside, ran the plates, and dispatched units to perform a welfare check at 1911 Furlong Run. That is when the bodies were discovered. Ryder and Cassie fled in Mindy's car to 4025 McGinnis Ferry Road in Suwannee. On April 9, 2017, after a standoff with the Gwinnett County SWAT team, both were apprehended. Both had self-inflicted wrist wounds. Both were taken into custody alive. In July 2017, both were indicted on charges of murder, aggravated assault, aggravated battery, armed robbery, and theft. District Attorney Danny Porter announced he would seek the death penalty for Ryder. Cassie was not eligible because she was a minor at the time of the crime. On February 2, 2018, both Johnny Ryder and Cassandra Bjorge pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony murder to avoid the death penalty. Gwinnett County Judge Deborah Turner sentenced both to consecutive life in prison. From the bench, Turner addressed Cassie and Ryder directly. She told them, "I just continue to be stunned that you sealed areas so that you could make sure the smell of decaying human flesh wouldn't be noticed. That you had parties and ordered Chinese food with 2 people that you had brutally murdered lying upstairs." Today, Johnny Ryder is incarcerated at Central State Prison in Macon. Cassandra Bjorge is housed at Lee Arundel State Prison in Alto. While one Georgia investigation closed in less than a year, the next would take more than half a century to find an answer. Debbie Lynn Randall. The next case is Debbie Lynn Randall, and it sat in a Cobb County evidence locker for 51 years before a single strand of hair finally pointed to a name. By the time investigators found him, he had already been buried for almost 5 decades. So how do you arrest a man who is already dead? Debbie Lynn Randall was a 3rd-grade student at Pine Forest Elementary School in Marietta, Georgia. On the evening of January 13, 1972, around 7 o'clock, she walked to a laundromat that sat just half a block from her family's apartment. Her stepfather had driven her there and then left her behind. The plan was simple. She would walk back home when the wash was done. She never made it. Around 8:30 that night, her mother realized she was missing. The only clue investigators found was a trail of spilled detergent across the street from the family's home. Detergent on the pavement. That was it. What happened next was the largest search Cobb County had ever organized. The Cobb County District Attorney's official press release of September 18, 2023, recorded the number precisely. Exactly 4,000 volunteers joined what became known as Operation Debbie. They walked fields, they searched ditches, they knocked on doors. Day after day, nothing. 16 days later, on January 29, 1972, a group of students from Southern Tech found her body. She was discovered near the intersection of Windy Hill Road and Powers Ferry Road. She had been harmed, and her death was ruled a strangulation. The original investigation chased hundreds of leads. None of them held. Suspects were interviewed, eliminated, and shelved. And then the file went cold. It stayed cold for decades. Could anyone really still find the answer this long after the trail had gone silent? In October 2001, almost 30 years after Debbie was killed, a hair recovered from her body was finally sent to the FBI for DNA testing. The results ruled out many of the original suspects. In May 2015, a piece of cloth that had been collected at the original scene was sent for updated analysis. That second round of testing pulled a partial male DNA profile out of the fabric. For the first time, investigators had something genetic to compare against the world. But there was nothing in any database to match it to. The case did not move again until the Cobb County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit took it on under investigator Ron Alter. The unit turned to investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in California. They uploaded the unknown profile to open-sourced ancestry sites and began building a family tree backward from the matches that came up. The tree led them to a man named William B. Rose, who had lived in Mableton, Georgia. In 1972, he had been 24 years old. He had no known direct connection to Debbie, but he had family members who lived in the same apartment complex as the Randalls. He had been within walking distance. There was a complication. William B. Rose had died in 1974, only 2 years after Debbie was killed. He had taken his own life. To prove the match, investigators had to go further than any Cobb County file had ever required. They exhumed his body. The DNA recovered from his remains was tested against the profile pulled from the evidence in 2015. It was a match. Investigators believe the killing was a crime of opportunity. Cold case investigator Morris Nix summed up the moment at the press conference. He said, "Technology does not get old. It doesn't retire. It doesn't get sick. And it doesn't quit." Technology was seeking William Rose, and it found him in the grave. Cobb County District Attorney Flynn D. Brody Jr. publicly announced the case had been solved on September 18, 2023. By that point, both of Debbie's parents had passed away. Her mother, Juanita, had died of leukemia in 2018. Her father, John, had died in 2022. Neither lived to learn the name. Her brother, Melvin, spoke to reporters that day and said he wished his mother was still alive, but that he knew she was in heaven and that it was finally over. While one investigation finally closed because the killer was already dead, the next would close because a killer who had been hiding in a different country decided, after nearly 2 decades, to come home. Doris Spillers-Worrell. The next case is Doris Spillers-Worrell, and for 19 years, her husband walked free on a different continent. He raised her 3 children alongside the very woman investigators say helped end her life. So what finally pulled him back across the border? Doris Annette Spillers-Worrell was born September 18, 1967, in Fort Valley, Georgia. She graduated from the University of Georgia. She worked as an elementary school teacher before becoming a stay-at-home mother of 3. She was an active member of First Baptist Church in Douglas, Georgia. At 39 years old, she was raising her family alongside her husband, John Worrell, who co-owned a family business with her called John's Sports Park, an arcade and skating rink in the small Coffee County town of Douglas. On September 20th, 2006, Doris was found shot to death inside the sports park. According to John's initial statement to investigators, he had gone to the hardware store and had returned to find her. The shooting had taken place in a section of the park that was not covered by surveillance cameras. An 18-year-old Venezuelan immigrant named Paula Yarberry, who lived with the family as the children's live-in nanny, was visible on camera in a different part of the park at the time. The early theory was a botched robbery. The early years of the investigation ran into walls. In 2008, 2 sports park employees named Glidden Rodriguez and Brandon Cage were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The charges did not hold. They were dropped for lack of evidence. The Spillers family put up a $20,000 reward. Governor Sonny Perdue added $5,000 more. Nothing surfaced. Could the truth really be hiding in plain sight inside the family itself? What investigators eventually pieced together was a different story entirely. John Worrell had been having an affair with the live-in nanny, Paula. He feared that a divorce would cost him custody of his 3 children. Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Jason Sechrist would later describe John's mindset to reporters. He said, "It's those thoughts that led him to begin recruiting someone to murder his wife." After the killing, The pieces moved quickly in directions investigators could not follow. Paola was deported back to Venezuela. John Worrell left the United States. The two reunited in Costa Rica, where they lived together as a couple for years. And the 3 children Doris had left behind grew up in that household in another country, raised in part by the woman investigators now say helped take their mother's life. The break in the case did not come from new evidence. It came from a breakup. After years together in Costa Rica, John and Paola separated. John returned to the United States quietly. He settled in Maryville, Missouri, a small town far from Georgia, and tried to start over. By that point, one of the original Coffee County suspects, Glidden Rodriguez, had died. The other, Brandon Cage, had recently been released from prison on an unrelated case. In April 2025, Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents and Coffee County investigators traveled to Costa Rica. They met with Paola. She cooperated. What she told them was enough. On May 20th, 2025, John Worrell, then 58, was arrested at his home in Maryville, Missouri, with the assistance of the Missouri State Highway Patrol. He waived extradition. He arrived at the Coffee County Jail late on May 22, 2025. He was charged with malice murder, felony murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and aggravated battery. At his first appearance on May 23, 2025, bond was denied. Coffee County Sheriff Fred Cole told reporters that day, "This case has never been forgotten. Justice delayed is still justice. Paola has not been charged." Agent Seacrest stated publicly that in the GBI's view, she is not considered a suspect. Doris's sister Leanne Tuggle later spoke to reporters about the woman she had lost. Of Paola, she said, "Sometimes she was too kind for her own good. Her being kind is ultimately what caused her death." The case is currently being prosecuted by the Waycross Judicial Circuit District Attorney's Office. John Worrell remains in custody awaiting trial. While one Georgia killer hid behind a quiet marriage, the next had built his life around terror itself. And an entire city in West Georgia would spend 2 years afraid to fall asleep. Stalking strangler. The next case is the man Columbus. Georgia knew only as the stalking strangler. And for 2 years in the late 1970s, elderly women across the Winton neighborhood were dying behind locked doors. How does an entire community of grandmothers become the target of one man? And why did it take until 2018 to bring him to a final ending? The killer's name was Carlton Michael Gary. He was born September 24, 1950, in Columbus, Georgia. On March 15, 2018, at 10:33 at night, he was executed by lethal injection at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson. He was 67 years old. His targets were specific. Every known victim was an elderly white woman who lived alone in or near the Winton neighborhood of Columbus. Everyone was harmed and then strangled, most of them with their own stockings. Most were partially or fully covered after death. The first was Ferna Jackson, 60 years old, on September 16, 1977. 9 days later, on September 25th, Jean Dimenstein, 71, was killed. On October 21st, Florence Schiebel, 89, legally blind and dependent on a walker, was found dead in her home. 4 days later, on October 25th, Martha Thurmond, 69. 2 months after that, on December 28th, Kathleen Woodruff, 74. On February 11th, 1978, Ruth Schwab, 74, was attacked but managed to trigger a bedside alarm. She survived. The very next day, Mildred Borum, 78, was strangled with a Venetian blind cord in her home. The final known victim was Janet Kofer, 61, on April 19th or 20th of 1978. Kofer did not even live in Winton. She had simply attended choir practice at Winton Methodist Church that night. The original investigation was complicated by something almost no one anticipated. A hoaxer began sending letters to media and law enforcement, claiming to be the chairman of the forces of evil, asserting that the killings were the work of white men targeting black women. The hoax was eventually tied to a separate killer named William Henry Hance, who was responsible for killing 3 women near Fort Benning during the same time period. Hance was later executed by Georgia's electric chair on March 31, 1994. While the Winton attacks went unsolved, Carlton Gary was moving. In December 1978, he was arrested in Gaffney, South Carolina for an armed robbery. He confessed and was sentenced to 21 years. Then, on March 15, 1983, exactly 35 years to the day before his eventual execution, Gary escaped custody. He remained at large for roughly a year before being recaptured. The piece that finally connected him to Columbus was a pistol. A handgun stolen from a Winton area home in October 1977 was traced back to him. On May 3, 1984, he was arrested for that burglary. A fingerprint match would tie him to the killings themselves. His trial took place in 1986. He was indicted in Muscogee County for the deaths of 3 of the women, Shebel, Thurmond, and Woodruff. The prosecution introduced what was called similar pattern evidence from the other killings to show jurors how methodical the attacks had been. The lone surviving victim from Georgia, Ruth Schwab, identified him in court. In August 1986, Carlton Gary was convicted on 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of burglary and sentenced to death. The appeals process consumed more than 3 decades. The Georgia Supreme Court halted his scheduled execution just hours before it was set to take place on December 16, 2009. Years passed. In 2007, separate DNA testing linked Gary to the 1975 death of 40-year-old Marion Fisher in Syracuse, New York. Onondaga County prosecutors declined to bring new charges because he was already on death row in Georgia. On February 23, 2018, the Muscogee County Superior Court set a new execution window. On March 15, 2018, Carlton Gary was executed by lethal injection at 10:33 at night. He declined to give a final statement. For his last meal, he had requested whatever everyone else at the prison was being served for dinner that day. Author David Rose published a book called The Big Eddie Club that questioned whether Gary was responsible for every killing he was convicted of. While one Georgia killer spent his final hours inside a prison wall, the next was still hunting the woods. National Forest serial killer. The final case is a drifter named Gary Michael Hilton, the man who turned the national forests of the Southeast into his personal hunting ground. He traveled with a golden retriever and a van. He looked to most hikers like a harmless older man. How many people did he pass on a trail before someone realized what he was? Gary Michael Hilton was born November 22, 1946, in Atlanta, Georgia. He was a U.S. Army veteran who had served as a paratrooper before being honorably discharged in 1967, following a documented schizophrenic episode. By the early 2000s, he was a drifter, moving through national forests across multiple southern states, living out of a 2001 Chevrolet Astro van with his golden retriever, Dandy. His confirmed harm against others started in late 2007. On October 21, 2007, an elderly couple named John Jack Davis Bryant and Irene Woods Bryant disappeared while hiking in Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. They were a retired couple from Horseshoe, North Carolina. Their family did not report them missing for nearly 2 weeks. Irene's body was eventually located. Jack's remains were identified later. Hilton would not be charged in their deaths for years. In December 2007, a woman named Cheryl Hodges Dunlap, a Sunday school teacher and a nurse, was killed in Apalachicola National Forest, Florida. Her body was discovered there. Investigators would eventually link Hilton to the killing through forensic evidence. Then came the case that finally pulled the threads together. Her name was Meredith Hope Emerson. She was 24 years old. She had graduated from the University of Georgia with honors in French. She lived in Beaufort, Georgia. On New Year's Day of 2008, she went hiking on Blood Mountain in the Chattahoochee National Forest with her black Labrador, Ella. Before leaving, she chalked a note onto a board at her apartment for her roommate. The note read, "Taking Ella hiking. I hope you had fun." Witnesses on the trail later reported that an older man with a dog had been seen following Meredith on the spur trail that day. She was taken. According to court records, Hilton held her in his van for several days and repeatedly tried to force her to give him the PIN code to her bank card. She gave him wrong numbers over and over. Could one woman's stubbornness really hold off a killer for that long? On January 4th, 2008, Hilton took her to the Dawson Forest Wildlife Management Area, where her life was ended. Investigators would later confirm she had been decapitated post-mortem. The breakthroughs came in pieces. Meredith's car was found on January 3rd at the Blood Mountain trailhead, with her water bottle, dog leash, and a police baton still inside. On January 4th, Ella was found wandering, alive, in a Kroger parking lot in Cumming, Georgia. On January 5th, Meredith's bloody clothing, her wallet, her UGA student ID, her driver's license, and a blood-stained car seatbelt were located in a dumpster near a Quick Trip in Cumming. A former police officer recognized Hilton from witness descriptions. Callers reported a man matching the same description at a Chevron near Vogel State Park. He was arrested at that gas station. Hilton offered investigators a trade. He would lead them to Meredith's body in exchange for 2 things. First, that the death penalty be taken off the table. Second, that his dog Dandy be safely rehomed. He told them, the head will be missing. He led them to the Dawson Forest. On January 30th, 2008, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced in Georgia to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The other states followed. In April 2011, Hilton was sentenced to death in Florida for the killing of Cheryl Dunlap. On April 25, 2013, he pleaded guilty in North Carolina to the kidnapping and killing of the Bryants and received 4 life sentences. His own words to GBI investigators were chilling. Of Meredith, he said, "She wouldn't stop. She wouldn't stop fighting and yelling at the same time. So I needed to both control her and silence her." Hilton has long been suspected of other killings stretching back further than his confirmed cases. Today, Gary Michael Hilton remains on Florida's death row. In April 2025, Court TV aired an episode of Interview with a Killer featuring him, his first public interview in 17 years. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.